Well, Canada's freezing winter weather is not stopping supporters of Aboriginal rights from voicing their discontent. Members of Aboriginal communities and rights activists have rallied as part of a global day of action organized by Idle No More, a group campaigning for the rights of Aboriginal peoples. Protests were planned in at least 30 Canadian cities, as well as in other countries, including Australia and the U.S. Organizers say the day of action is meant to protest against the Canadian government's attacks on democracy, Indigenous sovereignty, and human rights. Aboriginal communities have held many rallies over the past weeks in protest of the poor living conditions across Canada. Let's switch over to Calgary, joined by Press TV's correspondent Joshua Blakeney. Hi, Joshua. Joshua, fill us in on exactly what has taken place as far as the latest protest from Idle No More.
Hi, Marzia. Yes, arguably something unprecedented in Canada's history. Around the world, from Sweden to Sydney, from Greenland to Las Vegas, global citizens were protesting the Harper government's crimes against the Aboriginal peoples of this country. I myself was on the streets of Calgary today at an Idle No More protest and must have interviewed about a dozen Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal activists, and they were highly displeased with the Harper government. What they said is the Harper government's criminality. Of course, as I've repeatedly said in Press TV interviews of late, Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution says that Aboriginal and treaty rights are hereby recognized and affirmed. And the First Nations people in this country are aware that that is the supreme law of Canada. And so they're questioning why it is that the Harper government is getting away scot-free with enshrining pieces of legislation, such as the highly controversial Bill C-45, that are inconsistent with that supreme law of Canada. Aboriginal peoples were saying to me, for example, today, why is it that we have the police surrounding us at these protests? In Canada, invariably Aboriginal peoples are criminalized, thrown into jail, brutalized often, and yet the 1%, the well-heeled in Canadian society and the political class, are afforded impunity. And it gets to the sad reality that in this country there is no rule of law for the rich and powerful and for the political class, and that is exemplified with Bill C-45, which, you know, the First Nations people in this country are highly educated, and they know that those laws are incompatible with Canadian treaties and with the Canadian Constitution. Now, obviously, there's a global dimension to this, and that speaks to the reality that the Harper government is perceived to be shredding up Canada's rather good reputation, or historically good reputation in the world. I interviewed elders today who were very upset with the role of resource companies. Of course, Alberta, you know, there's a global spotlight right here on Alberta with the tar sands oil developments, and the Indigenous peoples I was with today in Calgary are the people who are being dispossessed in this region. And they're very upset with the treatment of the environment. The Athabasca River that runs in northern Alberta, there's cancerous fish coming out. One elder I mentioned drew the analogy with the rape that went on in the residential schools in Canada, the assimilationist, orphanage-style residential schools that have been accused of being vehicles of genocide in Canada's history. An analogy was drawn with the rape of girls in those schools and the rape of the environment in Canada to this day. And so the Aboriginal peoples are not pleased with the Harper government. Interestingly, we also had a new Democratic Party opposition member of Parliament introduce a private members bill to ask the Harper government to ensure that Canadian laws are consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, revealingly, in 2007, Canada voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous peoples, because that makes reference to things like collective rights, something which the Harper government appears to be ideologically opposed to. You see, the First Nations of Canada, they want to envisage a Canada, something like the European Union, where sovereign nations relate to one another on a nation-to-nation basis.
Well, Joshua, just really quickly, sorry to jump in, but it seems this time around that the Aboriginal people are very adamant and staying out there and being very much on the scene. Is it basically a reaction to the Harper government? Because, of course, we know the Aboriginal rights have not been basically respected for many, many years or ever. But why are we seeing this time around? It seems that they are extremely determined to stay on the scene and to make sure that they try to get their rights this time around.
Yes, well, you have to understand that the Harper government doesn't respect Aboriginal sovereignty. He wants Aboriginals just to assimilate into Canadian society and be treated like any other Canadian. But there has been legal provisions in Canada's legal frameworks to allow for Canada's Aboriginals to have special treatment. So it's not just we're all individuals under the law, but that there's some recognition that there's been this crime of colonization and that these are the original peoples of Canada. And so this Bill C-45, it's clear that the Harper government's intention is to do away with the collective lands. You know, there's reserves in Canada,
Okay.
reservations in the United States. And there, you know, obviously 99% of the historic territories have been taken away from Canada's First Nations, but they have this 1% of the land, which are these collectively held reserves. And there are provisions in Bill C-45 basically for the privatization and selling off of these lands, which are...
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. Press TV's correspondent Joshua Blakeney. Well, Canada is feeling the pinch of the global financial crisis as the international credit agency Moody's downgrades 6 top Canadian banks.